Very few people in Western history actually lived like Jesus lived or wanted people to live. They lived the opposite of the way Jesus wanted people to live, but they still expect the Jew to live like Jesus. Today's class is titled, Who's Afraid of the New Jew? Now, what do I mean exactly by the new Jew? So basically the new Jew is the armed Jew, the strong Jew, the Jew who's able, who's willing to defend himself and even, God forbid, to attack when necessary. Now this new Jew is not really new. The Bible actually, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, is full of this so-called new Jews. Jews who were fighters, who were warriors, who were very brave, very courageous. In fact, the whole notion of the Jew who's totally passive and is only into learning and is someone who is very soft and introverted, it's relatively speaking a later addition into history. But what happened was that this strong Jew, the Jew who's standing up for what he believes in, who's willing to actually fight, who's taking part in actual history making, has been away for a long, long time. And so he was forgotten. And what happened was that both Jews and non-Jews got used to not having him around. They got used to a different image of what a Jew is like, what Judaism is like, and they've grown accustomed to this. And even in a way, they fell in love with the archetype of what we call the exile Jew, the Jew who's the learner, who's the student, who's passive, who is taking everything and saying, well, it's from God, and he accepts it, and he's not willing to fight and stand up and oppose the very negative and harmful forces that are at work in the world. And it's very interesting to understand that both non-Jews and Jews have really fallen in love with this figure, this image of what Judaism is like. It's in fact a very partial image of what Judaism really is. It's an aspect of Judaism. It's a very strong aspect of Judaism. It's a very strong aspect of what it means to believe that there is an all-powerful God who's really running the show, running the world. He's doing everything, and therefore everything that is happening, including the very evil things that are happening, are in some profound way part of God's good will. They're actually a blessing in disguise, and therefore we need to not only look at the world as if it all depends on us, it all depends on our decisions, our forces, if we oppose or don't oppose reality. So the fact that Jews have had this image of being very, again, passive and submissive is coming from a very deep and very real place of faith, of emunah, that Judaism is all about. The fact that we are seeing the world, it's not only run by people, by empires, by kings. It's not just human forces at play or natural forces at play. There's also a divine narrative that's being unfolded, a divine story, and it's always hidden, and you never know who's really in control. And that is the source of this very, basically very positive kind of passivity, or this taking a side-looking sort of glance at the world, being a little bit on the outside of it, looking at the world from the side and letting things play out and not being at the forefront of pushing and doing everything, which could be a show of unfaithfulness, of not believing that the true being pulling all the strings behind the curtain is God. And yet, all this is a very, very narrow, partial aspect of what Judaism is all about. But it has been the dominant aspect of what Judaism is. And therefore, we all fell in love with it. We got so used to it, of imagining, of even hearing the word Jew, Jewish, Judaism, and thinking about this kind of, not always, not for everyone, but for many people, again, Jews and non-Jews alike, they fell in love with this image. And again, the reason is that the strong Jew that we now call the new Jew, which is really a renovated Jew, or a Jew that's been taken out of a certain, like an historical archive and been renewed, he's been away for a long, long time. Now, how long has he been away from? So there are several sort of dates we can give. On the surface, the sort of later date we can say is the destruction of the Second Temple, right? That's late 1st century CE, 70 CE or 68, when the Second Temple was destroyed. What happened was that the Jewish rabbis accepted this fact. They realized history is changing. We don't have our kingdom anymore. We don't have our temple anymore. It was like a dead man walking for some time because the Romans were in control long before the destruction of the temple. But this was like the final blow, that the temple was destroyed, and this is considered the beginning of the long 2,000-year-long exile that Jews are. To a certain degree, we're still in it because the third temple doesn't exist. And of course, there's this big debate whether the state of Israel is maybe the end of the exile. Is it or isn't it? That's part of the topic we want to talk about today. But when the Second Temple was destroyed, it was for sure the beginning of the exile. And then a very famous rabbi, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he said, in this case, we're not going to let Judaism go. We're not going to give up. He said, I prefer to be exiled from Jerusalem to Yavne, that's a different town, and I will have Yavne and its wise scholars. Tnuli et Yavne v'chachamea. And in Yavne, I will rebuild Judaism in a different mode, in a different way. It'll be a scholarly Judaism, not a Judaism of the sword, not a Judaism of ruling, not a Judaism of political power, not a Judaism of authority. It'll be a Judaism of books, of questions and answers and learning. And this was just the final phase in several phases of, like, in many ways, the final blow to political Judaism and to militant Judaism. It was out of the picture. And we're talking almost to the day, and it'll be a few decades away now, 2,000 years since this happened. Incidentally, the town that he moved to, Yavne, if you look at the Hebrew word Yavne, you can permute the letters, it creates the word Bina. Bina is the faculty of human understanding, the opposite of Chokhmah. Chokhmah is divine wisdom. And the part of the characteristics of Chokhmah, of divine wisdom, the opposite of Bina, Yavne, is that from Chokhmah comes the divine-like authority to rule, to govern, to hold a kingdom. It descends from this chokhmah. Why? Because you need to have the faith that you are holding on to an absolute divine truth, and then you can use that to govern and to rule. But if you lose this chokhmah, wisdom aspect of what Judaism is all about, and you focus mostly or almost exclusively on the binah, the understanding, human understanding aspect, that means that you've descended into this world, and now you don't have this sense of absolute divine truth backing you up so that you can use that to come to the world with a kind of authority, political authority, and so on. And so when he said, I'm going to be exiled willingly, again, accepting the fact that the Romans destroy the temple, and the Romans have the upper hand now, and will for who knows how long. Today we know that it's going to be 2,000 years. But he says, when I'm going to Yavne, again, the same letters as Bina, he says, I'm going to switch. There's going to be a big, big switch from the sense of holding on to an absolute truth and then using that as a way to be very forceful in the way you come to the world. And I'm going to focus on human understanding, different rabbis sitting around a table, opening the books of the Torah, asking questions, giving answers, having other answers, debating, not always reaching even answers or absolute answers. It remains this point of view or that point of view. And then that's how we became the scholarly nation that we all know. It started before, but this was in many ways the final and most significant step in all of this. Now, really, so it's the final step, but really we can give some stages before. So what was the stage before? We talked about now the destruction of the second temple, but really it started in the destruction of the first temple. What happened after the destruction of the first temple? We were exiled to Babylon, and that was when prophecy started fading away, like a sun setting, and the scholarly wisdom started growing. At that point, it was only the Mishnah, the first level of the oral Torah, and later on, when we're talking about the destruction of the second temple, the transition to Yavne, that very soon will become the end of the Mishnah period and the beginning of the Talmudic period. That's the archetypal scholarly Jew with all the different questions and answers. The Mishnah was just the beginning of that. Already, so now going back to the earlier stage, the destruction of the first temple, once we had some Jews living in the land of Israel and other Jews living in Babylon, then this distinction between Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, and Babylon already became a little bit of two types of Jews, the two types of Jews we're talking about. There's a beautiful expression in the Talmud that contrasts what is called Chasidei de Bavel, the Hasidim, or the devout Jews of Babylon. Chassidut has to do with love, with kindness, with softness, with being very forgiving. So Chasidei de Bavel, the Hasidim, the devout Jews of Babylon, they were very soft. They lived in Babylon. As opposed to some other rabbis who lived in Eretz Israel, and they were called Takifei Aradi Israel, the forceful of the land of Israel. So you had these two different types, right? Even before the time of the destruction of the second temple. This goes way back. There was this distinction. Outside of Israel, where you feel the exile in Babylon, you're soft, you're kind, you're forgiving. But if you live in the land of Israel, you have to be tougher. You have to have this takifut, this toughness, this forcefulness. Already then, we see the split. But we can even take it one step backwards, even further backwards. The two stages we talked about are two stages of the formation of the oral Torah, right? The Mishnah period in Babylon, and then you have the split between the tough of the land of Israel and the softer Jews of Babylon, and later on, the destruction of the second temple and the beginning of the Talmudic era. If we go even further back in history to the biblical time itself, biblical time, that's the written Torah, that's the time of the Jews who were fighting, who were forceful, who could wage wars, then is really where the split begins. It's a deep, deep inner split within what Judaism is all about, within the Jewish nation, within the Jewish story. The split is between Jacob and his twin brother Esau. Already the split was there. Jacob is described as he was growing up. He is described as Ishtam Yoshev Ohalim, an innocent dweller of tents. He is inside the tents. He is introverted. The tents, the sages say, are the tents of the Torah. He was learning Torah, the Torah that they had. Basically, he was meditating, was connecting to God. He was thinking about God, but he was an introvert. He was an innocent dweller of tents. But his twin brother was the opposite. His twin brother, who was not the father of Israel, he was a man of hunting, a man of the field. Ish tzayid, ish sadeh. And he was an extrovert. He was hunting, he was fighting on the outside. And this split, and here the Jew is the softer one of the two. This is where the story of the softer, more introverted, more submissive Jew is born. It's a very deep, profound aspect of what Judaism is all about. But of course, from the very same story of Jacob and Esau, Yaakov and Esau, we also learn that the real story is that although Yaakov starts out this way, Jacob starts out this way, his ultimate destiny is to confront Esau, first to confront the angel of Esau, and to triumph over the angel of Esau, and then to receive a new name. What is this name? Israel. Now, how is the word Israel translated? Israel, when he fights the angel, and he fights him all night, and the angel is the angel, the root angel, or the soul root of Esau, after he fights him and he wins, he comes out triumphant in the early morning after a night-long fight, then the angel gives him this name, Yisrael. Why? So the Hebrew phrase is, Ki sarita be'elohim uve'anashim vetuchal. Sarita im Elohim ve'im anashim vetuchal. You have, so how is it translated? Most translations say, you have wrestled with gods and men, or you have contended with gods and men, or you have striven, from the word strife, with gods and men, and you prevailed. But in fact, that's not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew says, you have triumphed over gods and men, or angels and men, and you have succeeded in attempting and succeeding to actually be triumph over them. Sarita. Sarita comes from the word sar and srara. Sar is a governor, srara is the power to govern. Sarita, im Elohim v'im anashim, you have fought and triumphed. It's far more dramatic than having this expression that people are in love with, wrestling with God. We are the wrestlers with God. We all need to wrestle with God. Now there's a new book, Jordan Peterson, he called it We Who Wrestle with God. It's a nice image to have. And in fact, that's what happened during that night. Jacob indeed wrestled with the angel. But the end result of this and the meaning of his name is not the wrestling. It's the being actually triumphant and being not, it's not governing God himself, but it's governing like an angel or part of God. Although later on in the Talmud, God would actually say in a very famous Talmudic story, he would tell the Jewish rabbis, you have triumphed over me. Nitzchuni banai, my own children have triumphed over me. Why? Because the Jewish sages in their oral Torah have received the authority to have the final word on the actual details of Jewish law, of Torah law. Torah law is, in the Bible, it's very generally stated, but when it gets down to what do we actually do and how do we interpret the different phrases that are not always so clear, then it's the Jewish people, the Jewish sages, who have the final word. And there's this famous story about one person arguing with the rest, one rabbi arguing with the other rabbis, and he tells them, if I am correct, let this miracle happen and that miracle happen. And it all happens. The water starts flowing backwards, upwards, and different miraculous things start happening. But the majority of the rabbis are triumphant over him. They say, you may do all your miracles, but you're in the minority. We think otherwise. And halacha, the Jewish law, was proclaimed after them, not after him, although he was able to recruit all these miracles. And then God was heard saying, Nitzchuni banai, my own children have vanquished me. So when we go back to the Tanakh, to the Bible, we see on the one hand the birth of the weak Jew, the submissive Jew, the introverted Jew, who's in the tent, who's not hunting, who's not out in the field, who's passively accepting what's his lot as not the elder son. But then his mother tells him, you have to inherit the blessings, and then you have to go abroad, you have to come out of your protected shell, protected, shielded surrounding, you have to go out and face reality. And he goes out and he toughens and he learns and he matures, and then he receives the name Israel, which is coming from the word to govern, to be triumphant, to have this power. So we see that the true story is long before the destruction of the first temple and then the birth of Jewish scholarship, and long before the destruction of the second temple and the final emergence of the image, the archetype of the scholarly, non-political, non-militant Jew. We have this conflict within the heart, the very heart of hearts of what Judaism is all about, in Jacob and Esau. Jacob being the weaker counterpart, the weaker side, but then over time learning to confront his tougher, militant, combatant twin brother, and to be triumphant, and then to receive this new name. And then he's walking around with these two names. Yaakov standing for the more more passive and submissive aspect, and Israel standing for the more forceful, outgoing, triumphant aspect. But remember, why? So why did it end up reverting instead of going back to the more Yaakov weaker type? So, because the story is complicated. He was triumphant over the angel, but he came out limping. He came out wounded. It wasn't a complete triumph. It was enough of a triumph to earn him that name, but it wasn't a complete triumph. He came out of that battle, that conflict, limping, leaning on one side, carrying his weaker leg. He was wounded. And so this ended up, this weakness, the fact that he was not able to fully integrate the forceful, authoritative Israel with the weaker Yaakov, Jacob, that came about as this kind of limping. And that what ended up being that the whole spirit of the written Torah, of the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, with all its heroic stories, with all its battles and wars, it's ended up sort of fading away, and the two temples were destroyed, and a much more Yaakov-like, Jacob-like Jew archetype emerged, the archetype of the submissive Jew, the weak Jew, and that became the dominant image of what Judaism is for nearly 2,000 years, for many, many, many years. All over the world, in Christian countries, in Islamic countries, you could see this image of the Jew who was wandering from place to place, who had no land of his own, no state of his own, no army of his own, sometimes no property of his own. And he was very weak, and his only solace, his only source of comfort, his only source of sort of freedom was in the books, in the house of study, leafing through these ancient books, and again, going back to this scholarly lifestyle of asking questions and answering them and debating over them and finding subtler and subtler nuances inside the text. Very beautiful. All Jewish wisdom and the genius of Judaism and the creativity of Judaism is coming out of this. But we have to remember that the name Israel, the original name Israel, the ultimate calling and destiny of Yaakov to be strong, to be powerful, to win over his brother and the angel representing his brother, right? To win over angels and human beings and to come out triumphant, all this was sort of lost and faded into the background. Now, another thing was added to this. Around the same time of the destruction of the Second Temple, right? The final blow to the biblical Jew, to the Israel Jew, and the final moment in which the scholarly Jew was born, there was another Jew who was born, who ended up being one of the most famous Jews of all time, probably second only to Moses and Abraham. Maybe even that is questionable, but one of the most famous Jews who ever existed, and this is, of course, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew born in the land of Israel, towards very close to the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. You could feel the destruction was imminent. Judaism was very, very passive, very helpless in front of Roman power. And what he did was that he took the Jewish passivity, the Jewish powerlessness, the Jewish weakness to a radical extreme, a pacifist extreme. The extreme of not only not fighting, but turning the other cheek to someone who slaps you on the one cheek, to someone who says it's better to not carry the sword at all, even not for the sake of self-defense. Because if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And he adopted a very, very radical, one-sided, pacifistic, powerless theology that was almost like a caricature and a radicalization of what was part of Judaism at that time, being unpolitical and powerless, but he turned it from a predicament into an ideal. It was the Jewish predicament. He turned it from a predicament that we're forced to deal with into an actual ideal that's the way we're supposed to live. And this was the birth, of course, of Christianity. And Christianity took the world by storm. And it became the official Roman religion. And now what happened was very interesting. This is another element to add to how both Jews and non-Jews, I should say, both non-Jews and Jews, because it started with non-Jews, and then Jews caught on to this, fell in love with the image of the weak Jew. What happened is that the Western world, Europe, took this Jew, Jesus, and made him into the archetypal human being who ever lived, the ideal human being who ever lived. Not a real human being, but a part human being, part divine embodiment, like the Son of God and all this. And they took him and they idealized him. Now the thing is this: the Western empires themselves did not live up to Jesus' theology. They were not passive, they were not unpolitical, they were not turning the other cheek. In fact, they became the biggest, most powerful empires that ever ruled the world. The West is by far, there's the West and the rest, as people say. The West took over the world. The same Western civilization that adopted the figure of this weak, the radically weak Jew called Jesus, became the most powerful civilization that ever ruled the world. Why? Because they liked having Jesus and his words in the books and on the pulpits in their churches, but not in the practical world. In the practical world, they preferred to be, as every human being in the world is, to use power, to have political authority, to attack, to govern, to build an empire, to extend the empire, and to build colonies, and to be the biggest colonizer that ever lived. So, and what made them feel good about themselves is that when they opened the New Testament and when they went back to the church, they told themselves, oh, but really the ideal is to be very, very weak and very humble and not to desire any power. And that made them feel good about themselves so that they could go and be the strongest civilization that ever existed that changed the face of the entire world. For the good and sometimes for the bad. I'm not judging that. I'm just saying that there was this inner split. But what happened is that they took this ideal, they did not live by it at all. They never, almost never, very few people in Western history actually lived like Jesus lived or wanted people to live. They lived the opposite of the way Jesus wanted people to live. But they still expect the Jew to live like Jesus. Because in the back of their heads, they have this picture of this ideal human being. The ideal human being is very passive. He's crucified. How more passive can you be? He's totally crucified. He's totally powerless. He let himself die because he was opposed to using force of any kind. They did not live by this ideal because who wants to live like that? We want to build an empire and extend the empire. But they still expect, and in many, to a large extent, they still expect the Jew to live like Jesus. They expect the Jews to be like Jesus. This is the ideal Jew. This is the ideal human being. He was part of your people. So why aren't you turning the other cheek? Why aren't you being passive and submissive and accepting the fact that people are persecuting you and people that want to kill you, people want to destroy you, people want to annihilate you? And so they were so in love with the image of Jesus, but they told themselves, no, we can't live like Jesus. It's impossible. It's too much to ask. We can't live. But the Jews, they should live like Jesus. They should be like this. They should bow down their heads. They should accept their agony and their tribulations with love and with surrender. They should surrender to God, and they should be like Jesus, because that's the way a Jew should live. Not us. No, we're just regular people. And this is a very, very profound understanding of what happened in Western civilization. Now, the thing is this. In many ways, to a large degree, Jews subconsciously bought into this. And they accepted this to a certain way. They also forgot that Yaakov needs to become Israel. And that Jesus was never a representative of Judaism. It was a radicalization, a caricature of the predicament of powerlessness, turning it into an ideal that was never the Jewish ideal. And they started being convinced that this was in fact the fact, that this was in fact how they should live. And then they became very, very passive, very submissive. They kept praying that one day they should return to the land of Israel, and one day they should rebuild their temple, and one day they should have a kingdom, and one day they should be a light unto the nations. But they did nothing about this. It was very weak. And in a way, they realized, they fulfilled the non-Jewish fantasy and expectation of what they should be. Subconsciously, they accepted it. That was the depth of the exile. The depth of the exile is not just being outside the land of Israel, not having a kingdom, not having independence, not having power. The depth of the exile is that they were so submerged in non-Jewish consciousness that they became convinced that a little, again, subconsciously, because no Jew would admit this, they became subconsciously convinced that they need to be a little bit like Jesus. That's how deep the exile became. Also, by the way, in the Muslim countries as well. The Muslims, the Islamic countries as well, they would be more tolerant sometimes not, of the Jews, but only if they were in a submissive state, that they were less important, that they were more humiliated, they had more taxes, and so on. All this existed up until a few centuries ago, about 200, 300 years ago, in which time, starting with the 18th century and accelerating over the 19th century and reaching full bloom, in a way, in the 20th century, what happened is that the old dormant biblical genes of Judaism started awakening. In a way, it started with the Hasidic movement. Although Hasidut, we just said before, Hasidim are like those in Babylon. They were the Hasidim of Babylon. They're weak, they're kind. But part of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidut, part of his dream was to go back to the land of Israel and to sort of restart this motion of coming out of exile and reclaiming Jewish authority. And in a way, the Hasidic rebbes that existed everywhere were sort of mini monarchic courtyards, because the rebbe was a little bit like a king, and it was like drafts of the Messianic age in which there's going to be a Jewish political militant authority that's able to govern the world, not so militant, but like a political authority, a king, a Messiah king, a Mashiach. And they drafted this, or they made drafts of this by having a Rebbe and his followers. It was called courts, and it was a bit like monarchic courts. That's what they did. So this was like the early start of the old Jew, now called the new Jew, resurfacing. And then there was the non-Hasidic students of the Vilna Gaon, who started also coming to Eretz Yisrael, like a few Hasidim before them. And then, of course, what happened is that Zionism happened and grew and became a very dominant power in modern Jewish history. And then what happened is that this was the time that the image, the title, the concept of the new Jew was born. And he was called the Hebrew, the new Hebrew. They didn't like the word Jew so much. The word Jew was associated, Yehudi was associated with the weaker aspect, the Yaakov aspect of Judaism. And so they preferred to say Ivri, a Hebrew, which goes back to sort of Abraham, a more biblical figure. And they also spoke about a muscular Judaism. This was an expression by one of the central thinkers of Zionism, Nordau. He called it, we want now a muscular Judaism, not a passive, weak, pale Judaism. We want a Judaism that can plow the land, that can carry arms, that can fight, that can build. But the thing that what happened was, that's part of the dynamic of coming out of exile, is that this was done by deserting the exile, the weak Jew, the scholarly Jew. They didn't want us there. That's why they closed the books, and they took arms. They took up arms. They took up the plow, and they came to the land of Israel. They started working the land, but they didn't want the books of the Torah. Most of them. It was Israel. What's the word? It was Israel rejecting or pushing away, not accepting the fact that he's coming out of Yaakov, that he was first this sort of denying his roots as Yaakov. I was never Yaakov. I don't want to be Yaakov. Yaakov is weak. I just want to be Israel. What happens is that when Israel rejects Yaakov, he becomes a little bit like Esau, right? He becomes a little bit like a very muscular, very strong human being, but not so much a Jew. This is the Zionist ideal of the new Jew, someone who is connected to the land of Israel, to the Hebrew language, to maybe the biblical political history, but not everything in between, not the whole scholarly history of delving into the books and having the spiritual aspect, and certainly not the passive aspect of Judaism. So after almost 2,000 years of the biblical, triumphant, forceful Jew who is not ashamed, who doesn't balk from carrying arms and from fighting and standing up, it faded into the background. Now you had a total reversal of it. But of course what happens is that who doesn't like this? The non-Jews don't like this. Because in a way, they're still expecting Jews to be like Jesus. They don't like this new Jew. They don't like the Jew who is fighting, who is courageous, who is attacking. They keep saying, and that's what they're saying now. They're saying, ceasefire, right? Biden has now said, you had your revenge, as if revenge is what we wanted, as if the whole war in Gaza is a revenge. It's not a revenge. It's trying to get rid of an existential threat to us and to all of Western civilization, which is called Hamas and radical Islamism. And it's not in a question of revenge. We have no desire to have vengeance. We just want to get rid of this horrible threat that was neglected. And was the world, we, including us, we let this threat grow. So Biden is now saying, you've had your revenge, and now let's bring back the hostages, and now you go and rebuild Gaza. You turn the other cheek. You go and rebuild Gaza for them, and you let Hamas stay in power. Hamas, a horrible, sadistic terrorist group who's sadistic not just against Jews but also against Arabs, against themselves. Everyone who a little bit opposes them, they torture them in unbelievable ways, and they beat them to death, and horrible things that they're doing. But Biden is now saying, Jews, we will never be like this. If we were under a threat, we would go all the way and we would attack our enemies and we would chase them down until we exterminate them. But you don't have to live like that. You're not supposed to. You're supposed to be like Jesus. You're supposed to turn the other cheek, let Hamas stay in power, wait for the next October 7th, rebuild Gaza for Hamas, and then what then? And then another underground infrastructure, another October 7th. Crazy. But this is what's happening, because the world does not like us to be this new Jew who's really an old Jew, right? They want us to be like Jesus. Now, of course, what should we do? We should not accept this. But the problem is that we too have become convinced of the image of the weak Jew, the Jew that's in exile. That's the way we should live. We have accepted the same thing. Even now, in modern Israeli society, that we have an army for the first time in millennia, and we are fighting courageously, unbelievably courageously. We're fighting, and we're standing up, and we're saying never again, and we're living up to never again. Right? We were weak. We let it happen. We let what happened, but now we're fighting in incredible ways, and yet it is extremely hard, also in Israeli society today, to use words like conquest, like winning, like determining the war, like being offensive. It's offensive to use the word offensive. We're only on the defensive. The IDF is called Israel Defense Forces. We can't bear to think of ourselves as being the attacker, as being, as doing something preventive, and to initiate a fight, and to go all the way to realize that we have a people here that we have made several very lengthy, very far-reaching attempts to come to an agreement with them and to let them to share the land in some ways. They never accept it. They keep saying, both the more extreme ones and the more so-called moderate ones, they all say that they want to obliterate the Jewish state. They never, ever accepted the Jewish state as something that they're willing to live next to. And you only need a little bit of Arabic or someone to translate it for you to show you that in all their discourses, not just Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, also the Palestinian Authority, the Fatah, it's not so different. They don't have made this so much the Islamic language, but they have the same motif. The same motif is that this is a slow burn journey to wiping out the Jewish state. There's no willingness to accept this. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. From the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, that means wiping out the state of Israel. If internalizing the fact that this is the entity, this is the people that we're fighting, we have to be able to stand up and say, we need to have a one-sided total victory. We need to be able to say that. And yet it is extremely difficult for most Jews, not just left-wingers, but central Jews and moderate right-wingers. It's extremely difficult to say. Why? Because we fell in love with the image that we are only Yaakov and not Israel. We are only Yehudim and not Israelim. We are only Chasidei de Bavel, the devout Jews of Babylon, but not the forceful, powerful, authoritative Jews of Eretz Israel, of the land of Israel, which is what we have to be. It is very, very hard for us to think in this way. And it goes back to the fact that the whole narrative of the Israel state, the whole narrative of Zionism, is that Zionism is a reaction to anti-Semitism, to the pogroms, to the Holocaust. The state of Israel, on a deep, deep subconscious level of the Jewish people today in Israel, outside of Israel, is one big shelter. It's one big shelter. Because without this shelter, there's anti-Semitism, there's pogroms, there's the Holocaust, we'll be persecuted, we'll be killed. We wish we shouldn't live in the land of Israel. We only want to assimilate, but we're not given the option to assimilate. We can't assimilate. Okay, so we need to build a shelter. We need to all come into this land, the land of Israel, and center ourselves in this one little place and guard it with iron domes and with other domes and with all kinds of walls and all kinds of shelters and concrete rooms. And the whole mentality is a mentality of survivalism. It's only survivalism because it's the same. We're still in exile. We've internalized the image of the exiled Jew who's not supposed to fight for himself and to be outgoing in what he needs to bring to the world, in his calling. His calling is not just to survive next to other people who want to kill him. His goal is to make sure that the anti-Semitism and this hatred and this horrible ideologies like Islamism are replaced by a far more constructive worldview, a far more constructive theology of divine presence in the world, of being able to carry arms and being scholarly and to learn and to be kind and gracious and loving, but also forceful when necessary. To have this balance, it doesn't exist in Christianity, which is totally split between what the books say and how they actually live. It definitely doesn't exist in Islam, which is overtly militant and overtly wants to conquer the world in very forceful ways and to have everyone be submissive to it. That's the actual meaning of Islam. It's a totally different theology that we have, that we need to bring into the world. But no one is talking about that. We're only talking about we need to build a shelter. And so this is what is happening. And now the state of Israel is actually shrinking because the people have left the north, have left the south, and because we're in the state of mind of going inwards, being introverted instead of extroverted, being on the defensive instead of the offensive. And to truly reclaim the name Israel, the word Israel, the meaning of Israel means to be able to stand up and reverse the tide, turn the tide, to have this turning point. There's a beautiful Hasidic explanation that the devout of Babylon is like a line, without going into the details, it's like a line, whereas the forceful of Israel, Takifei de'arai de Israel, it's like a corner. What is a corner? A turning point. To come out of the passive, flowing with the direction that we know, the direction of survivalism, and just making by, trying to survive, trying to make it in this horrible world. No, we don't want to make it in a horrible world. We want to transform the world from a horrible place to a wonderful place, to a good place. And we have the means. We have the vision, we have the Torah, we have the wisdom, we have the experience. And even if it's not all up to us, we have a role to play. But it's definitely not a passive role of just surviving. And in front of this threat, we need to oppose the threat, annihilate the threat, and replace their ideology with a totally different worldview. But we're afraid. But the thing is, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not either or. We can be both Yaakov and Israel. It's two levels, and it's two layers. There's a Hebrew phrase that the Jewish man is like the sabra, which is really a South American cactus that was brought somewhere in the 16th century to Israel. But it became like a symbol of Israel, and that became the image of the Israeli-born Jew, right? The Israeli-born Jew is a sabra. And so the Israeli joke is that the Jewish man is like a sabra. He's very thorny on the outside, but he's very soft on the inside, right? That's a nice image. But we also need the opposite. The opposite is that we need to have like a spinal cord of iron. We need to be able to stand upright, be very forceful on the inside, and be very weak on the outside, very soft on the outside, right? Which is just like saying that when we're on the outside of Israel, we're in the exile, like in Babylon, then we can be devout, we can be weak. But when we go back into the center of our existence, which is the land of Israel, on the inside, we need to have like this iron cast, spinal cord, a skeleton, not an exoskeleton, like an inner skeleton on the inside, that we're standing up. We're not, soft beings that need an exoskeleton. That's the survival image, the survival mentality, that we're just going to surround ourselves by walls, and we're going to wait for people to stop attacking us, and we're going to push them a little bit back, and then hopefully they'll be, and then when they come back, we'll push them some more, and we end up just shrinking instead of expanding. And so we need to have this iron core on the center of us. This is the Takifei de Arad Israel, the forceful of the land of Israel. And this is having this, even the word Yisrael, it means what I said. It means the vanguard, being triumphant over the angel, over the God. But it also means being upright, being standing upright, yashar, right? Having this like a spinal cord that's, and being able to turn the tide, have this turning point, and not just be passive. A final word. If you listen to some of the pro-Palestinian chants that they're chanting and the way they're talking, we all know the river to the sea, but there's another word they're using. They're sometimes referring to the IDF, and they're not saying the IDF, they're saying the IOF. I don't know if you heard it. You can hear it in some videos. They're saying deliberately, the IOF. And it's not a mistake. They mean the Israel Occupation Forces. That's what they mean. They're saying it's not a defense force, it's an occupation. They're occupying the land that belonged historically to the Palestinians. Completely false narrative. It's not the time to go into it. But there was never a Palestinian state, and we never conquered it. We came back to our homeland. We started living side by side next to them. There was a partition plan. They refused it. There was a war. They lost. And that's when we started expanding the land. Up until, again, what I said is that now it's shrinking backwards. But it was never an occupation force, and the occupation definitely in Gaza is completely over, and that created this horrible enemy. But in a way, in a deep way, we can say that those people chanting and talking about the IOF are trying to tell us something. They're trying to tell us that we need to come out of the defensive state of mind, the purely defensive state of mind. Could stand for occupation. It could also stand for the opposite of defense, which is offense. To be on the offensive, not because we want to offend anyone or attack anyone. We don't. But when we're realistic and we're looking at the world, and we want to project, to bring outwards a vision, a theology, a message for the world. We have something to give to the world. And if we're being attacked, then it's not just being defensive. We need to be offensive. We need to come out of the passivity, come out of the survival mentality, and push back. That's what it means. This is the O here. It's pushing back strongly, powerfully against this enemy until it's completely gone, until it's completely lost. And being able to say that word, that we want victory, and we want decisiveness, and we want this war to end in a way that the threat is uprooted completely, not partially, not buying time, not going back to building another Iron Dome to be more the defensive. It means not shying away from the O word, the offensive word, which is being on the offensive. By the way, we can, if you, in order to maybe leave the IDF as it is, you can still call it defense as long as you add, as we all know, we bear in mind that it's also a preventive defense, right? What is like preventive medicine? What is preventive medicine? Is that you don't wait for the disease and then you start doing something. Is you live well, you eat well, and you eat good stuff, and the stuff makes you strong, and it pushes back, it pushes away the illness before it comes. We want to be able to push away the enemies, and it all starts with standing upright and with resuming, accepting the combination. That's the real combination we need of the old Jew and the new Jew. They're both old. They're both as old as time. They're rooted in Yaakov and Israel. The so-called old Jew is Yaakov, and the so-called new Jew is Israel. And it was one generation, one person, one human being embodied both of them. And we need to resume that, assume that, reclaim that, stand upright, and not shy away, not be afraid to express and to go out and to stand against this sea of anti-Semitism, this ocean of people telling us, you should live like Jesus, you should be like Jesus, and finally to be able to say, no, that's not the way a Jew should live. That is a warped way. You never lived in this way. We're definitely not supposed to live in this way. It's a false, kitschy, cute, like version of how you flatter yourself that maybe you should live. That's not the way you should live. You should be like Yaakov and Israel together. You can be both very, very kind, and you want the world to be very, very peaceful, and you want the world to be the kindest world that there is. But in order for the world to be so kind, in order for everyone to live peacefully next to one another, we have to stand up to evil and to stand up to radical, militant, hateful theologies and ideologies, and push them back forcefully, actively, until they cower back and they go back to the ground where they're coming from. Then maybe they could rethink their ways. But first we need to have this strong stance. So may we all, Bezrat Hashem, God willing, go back to who we are, to where we should be, and be able to portray that and give that out to the world. Bezrat Hashem. This video was made possible through the kind support of my sponsors over at Patreon. Patreon is a great way to help independent creators like myself produce original content. If you'd like to get more English language videos from me, please consider becoming a supporter via Patreon. You can find the link in the description below. Thank you very much.